start here with Professor Manlio Cinalli from SciencesPo Paris. He will be talking to us about the French case. Then we move to Patrick English on the other side of the table from University of Manchester. He will be talking about the British case. Then Professor Thomas Saalfeld from University of Bamberg will be talking about German experience. Then Steven van Hauwaert from Louvain will talk us about Belgium. Then Marc van Wardt from University of Amsterdam will talk us about Holland. And then finally, Daniela Vintila will talk us about the South European cases combined, so that's Spain, Italy, and Greece. So yeah, so 10 minutes each, please. Keep time to get less time?
No, if you stick to the 10 minutes.
Okay, so let's make it 8. So 8, 10-ish. Okay. Very good. Manlio, why don't you first?
Okay, so I start on the, well, you got all the slides in front of you, so for logistic reasons we're not going to present them. And the situation about France, well, the background, migration trends, we know that France traditionally is a country of outstanding immigration historically, but also statistically. At the moment, I mean, you see on the first slide that the percentage of a foreign-born population is basically over 11–12%. So it's one of the countries with a major bulk population. There are approximately 200,000 people every year entering in the French state, 100,000 of which more or less have been very approximate takes French citizenship. So it's a country with a huge population of migrants, of migrant descendancy, with a huge mobility, I would say, in terms of people getting French citizenship. This concept of République, what is the République? Well, I think that in most of the conceptualization of thinking of many French people, of French governors, the République would stand for something like a form of citizenship regime by which migrants get French citizenship very, very easily, very likely, at the individual level with a generous granting of individual rights. So for individual rights, I put in the second slide easy access to nationality acquisition by migrants, legal differentiation of access to rights according to nationality, strong sanctions against the discriminations based on ethnicity or race. So on this, but this is coupled with a sort of monist conception of citizenship. So the idea that group rights or rights that are expressed on behalf of particular communities should not really be promoted. Actually, in the best scenario, not even acknowledged. And this is possibly what would be the Republic. It's a sort of universalistic regime where the access of migrants into the French community happen to be through the individual level, but doesn't happen to be through the group rights collective level. This is in the theory, but then in the practice, and if you go in the slide number 5, there is this graph, and we try to situate France across the 4 corners of universalism, multiculturalism, assimilationism, and segregationism. So as I was saying, republicanism would be somewhere on the top left, so something that couples together cultural monism together with the civic territorial idea of large universal rights, where France doesn't really stick inside this universalist thing. It's actually somewhere in between universalism and assimilationism. So it's perhaps closer to universalism. If you go in the previous slides, you will see that the average of individual rights is plus 0.31, so it's somewhere on the good positive side, and then on the cultural difference is minus 0.33. Then if there is some question about operationalizations and the indicators in the discussion. But it's just to say where France is exactly located in this space combining individual rights with collective rights. The electoral system. Now, I mean, this was just to give you a very, very brief picture about the background. And then the electoral system, we know that France is particularly known for this 2-round system. And we know also that in the literature that it tended to benefit large parties, and it tends to favor the nomination and election of white, male, and middle-class candidates. Obviously, the idea is that at the end there is the idea that the person who will be elected will be a person that needs to gather always more than 50% of the support. So this, in some sense, goes to privilege and to favor the sort of dominant majority of the country. And we observe that more CAO and MP, member of parliaments of migrant origin, are nominated and elected in the constituency with high share of migrants. So this is not perhaps very surprising. As it is not very surprising that among political parties, it is political parties of the left that are much closer to the cause of migrants, to the demand of migrants, whereas the more we move on the right side, the more this sort of support decreases. And we see this in the slides number 7, but we see this also in following slides, particularly the slide 1 second. Well, you see, I wanted to be faster, but obviously. Public opinion, this is very interesting. So we are in the slide number 8. So on the one hand, we see that, and to cut short because there are only 2 or 3 minutes, we know also that as a result, we don't find many members of parliaments many members of migrant origin in the French parliament. So we have a very little representation in general terms. We are looking at the most in each legislature. I think the record was 38 members. The great majority of which are of European descendancy, and very, very fine, tiny elements, the other elements coming from an extra-European space. So this is just to say that, politically speaking, we understand that at the level of the party system, there are a number of constraints and restrictions in theoretical terms, but also in the practice that prevent a real representation of a big majority or big minority, if you like, a big percentage of migrants and people of migrant descendants to be translated into an effective representation in political terms. But this is in contrast, something very, very interesting with what we find in slide 8, so the public opinion. This is about the question of European social survey back in the some years ago, but migrants, a few years ago, migrants make France a worse or a better place to live. And actually what we find is that in the public opinion, for the great majority, they don't think that migrants make France a worse place. All of the opposite. There is only a little minority, something, well, not little minority, but in the worst scenario, there are to the 30% around the year 2004. So at the most, you had the 30% thinking that migrants would make it a worse place. So it's just to say that we have this big conflict in between a sort of space more open to migrants and in the public sphere and in the public opinion space, rather than in the translation of this into an effective representation in the parliament. And then if you see the public opinion, you find that particularly on the left side of the political spectrum, the pro-migrant public opinion is particularly strong. You find in slide 10 and 11 the precise numbers of people, of member of parliaments of migrant origin being elected. To cut it short, we have a very, very little representation. For this very little representation, the great majority are European, and the great majority are second generation. So it's actually people that have a migrant descendancy, quite distant in time, but they have not been migrants for a long time. And the final discussion, I would say, is the idea that perhaps we have to look better into the public sphere, because there are good signs to say that migration and pro-migrant positions and representation in the integration of migrants in France seem to happen quite a lot in the public sphere, in the public space, public opinion, with other data that we produce in this project about claims, intervention of organized publics in the newspapers or under media, etc. But once again, vertically speaking, in terms of representation in the institutional level with the assembly, it seems that a very, very big steps needs to be done again. Okay. To the next case.
Thank you, Manlio. So, Patrick, please.
So, yeah, thank you everyone. I'll be presenting the British case. It's been talked about a lot already today, and this presentation will be something of a replication of things that have come before, but hopefully enough in there will be new and interesting for everybody. So, Britain, of course, has a tradition of high immigration, and a tradition of discussion and policy around multiculturalism. To present the British case, we're going to look at both a two-way immigrant origin and non-immigrant origin case study, and three-way between ethnic minority groups within those migrant groups and white majority within the migrant groups as well, also to non-immigrant origin. And again, we do this because ethnic minority representation is the key issue really in British political discourse, both in terms of public and academic and policy. That's how we make this often framed. And in fact, if we use the definition of ethnic minority, I think only one MP that I can remember that the human code is a visible minority does not fall into the ethnic minority immigrant category as well. So, very good overlap there. And we can get more information, hopefully, about the underrepresentation of ethnic minorities in the United Kingdom by framing it in this three-dimensional or three-tiered space of ethnic minority, white majority, and non-immigrant origin. So, in terms of the first slide, largely replication of what's come before, we see, generally speaking, well, absolutely speaking, the percentage of House of Commons identified as immigrant origin is going up. However, around 20% of the census in 2011 identified with a non-British identity, and that's what I'm going to be using in this presentation, and we might use going forward to kind of give us a general sense of how many first and second generation migrants are in fact in the country. Of course, it's not perfect, as any measure of first and second generation immigrants that we have is. A lot of people may choose to identify solely with British in the second generation, but I think it should be getting to about the right amount. So if we move to look at the average education, so we're looking now at the kind of social demographic profiles of these rising numbers of ethnic minority and white majority immigrant origin MPs at the moment, just in that group together. We can see there's sort of a gap at the top end there, higher education in 2001, but this pretty much narrows down to nothing by 2010. It is statistically significant in 2001, so largely because we have a higher number of N than most other countries. These differences are actually significant. So 91%, 77%. So there's a little bit of a difference here, perhaps fitting into the overcompensation hypothesis that's sometimes talked about in terms of ethnic minority MPs having to work harder to get to representative levels than perhaps their ethnic minority and non-immigrant counterparts. But then if we move over to look at an indicator of occupation sector, so on the next slide, the fourth one, there we've got the actual sectors of public, private and third, and there's just no real differences here. So in terms of the routes of the kind of jobs that they're coming from, and we've again not quite operationalised how we're going to do professional classes, but they're looking at all lawyers and what have you. They're all quite similar in terms of the routes that they're coming in terms of occupation. It's very similar between immigrant origin and non-immigrant origin MPs. So while there are educational differences at the beginning of our study, there's not really any differences in occupation, which is very interesting. So if we turn then to the fifth slide, the fifth page, we begin to go deeper into the immigrant origin picture. So we start splitting up in between those that we identified as members of ethnic minority groups and those who we identified as part of the white majority or non-ethnic minority immigrant groups. And we can see the trends of representation differ. The ethnic minority section catching up quite a lot by 2010, and indeed something actually a little drop-off in the representation of white majority, although that's mostly because the dominant party in terms of providing representation, the Labour Party lost that election, of course, so they did lose a few seats, particularly the white Irish and down, we'll see a bit later. So what we can see, or what we can't see, sorry, from the graph I will tell you, is that by 2005, 2010, that percentage of the House of Commons that were identified as members of non-ethnic minority immigrant groups actually goes over the percentage that's reflected in the population. So At that point, they become overrepresented, the number of immigrants in Parliament from that group, the number of the population, which is of great interest. Because that means that perhaps it's the immigrant status insofar as that definition is concerned isn't really a barrier if the white majority immigrants are able to overcome that by 2005. So the question is really narrowing down to what is it about the visible status of the ethnic minority migrant group that's holding them back. That seems to be where we're going with that. Another interesting finding is it's split up by parties. You can see the red representing Labour, the blue representing Conservatives, and we've said before a couple of times the Conservative Party are catching up, and it's definitely something of a trend now, particularly when we see the low base that the Conservatives come from in 2001 Parliament to. They're still a little bit behind the Labour Party counterparts, but by and large, they're getting there. So then if we move to split this down even further into the specific migrant groups that a lot of these ethnic minority and white majority immigrant origin MPs come from, on page 6, we can see that it's dominated by a white Irish and white other group, and Dr. Russo presented this earlier. So the next slide kind of narrows that down once more, just so that specifically at the percentage of migrants within all ethnic minority origin MPs. The scale on that, this particular slide is wrong, I apologise for that. But we see even that then is dominated still by two groups of Asian, Indian and Black African groups. So it raises very, very interesting questions. And in fact, those two groups, in terms of the mirror status of the population, they're at 75%. So the percentage of the represented in the House of Commons is 75% of that for which they reflect in the overall population. So the disparity between ethnic groups is very, very, very interesting because it's not uniform at all. The next slide then presents how this goes across the study period. So we can see a very significant leap in the number of Black African representatives elected in 2010, whereas Asian and Indian groups have remained quite well represented. See the slide that the white Irish and white other continue to go up. So the main findings then, what we can really say is that it's increasing significantly, yes, and ethnic minority immigrant origin representation is increasing even faster. So I'll leave you to read through those because I'm running out of time. But essentially what we need to do going forward is look into these disparities between the groups even more, to see exactly what it is that might be holding particular groups back. Why are some ethnic minority immigrant origin groups doing so well compared to others? And then hopefully that will have implications for future research and future policy making in terms of targeting our resources of improving ethnic minority immigrant origin representation in the UK to those groups who are really struggling to achieve representation.
So, move to Thomas.
Okay, you have some very few data on the German case in your packs. I will not go through them in great detail. I will simply say, going back to our comparative data this morning, Germans like to compare themselves to Scandinavians and the Dutch, and we are lagging behind those two kind of areas big time in terms of the descriptive representation of citizens of immigrant origin. Although it is not equal across political parties, this is what one of those tables shows you. Actually, if you look at the data for the Green Party and the Left Party in Germany in the last 3 parliamentary terms, we added one, which isn't part of the pathways project, but it wasn't much difficult to collect those data. You can see that those two smaller left-wing parties actually have levels of representation that look like aggregate Dutch levels. So around about 10%. So it's not equally spread. It is also clear from this table that in 2013, you see the Christian Democrats catching up a little bit. And there's a story that we cannot, this could go down again, of course, at some point, but fundamentally it seems that increased descriptive representation has also something to do with more parties having more MPs. I have shown a brief a table from a different project like our Schönwälder that shows where the regional breakdown of regional MPs, and you can see that more than half of the regional MPs in Germany are from the 3 city-states, Berlin, Bremen, and Hamburg, And although these city-states don't necessarily have a higher level of people with immigrant background, Baden-Württemberg, for example, or Hesse have quite a high background level, but their representation in the regional parliament is not nearly as high. So we also have a few people put aside, people who have reached high office. We have one of them here amongst us today. So you can see those names. The few minutes that I have, I want to reflect a little bit away from these slides and think why has Germany been behind? Why is the misrepresentation so remarkable? And I think there are several reasons. One is the type of immigration we have. Actually, Germany has had massive immigration after the Second World War from Germans, but around about 12 million. That's a big number. There has been over the decades over 3 million immigrants who would can claim some sort of ethnic German ancestry, going back to the 18th century from Romania, from Russia, from Poland, etc. The integration and representation of these groups is very good. They have been well organized outside the sort of party political level, and they've always good. But this has been at the expense of the other great large group, and these are the so-called guest workers, who were recruited from the early 60s onwards. And these guest workers pose a problem. Why did they pose a problem? They posed a problem because of the way German citizenship is defined. German citizenship, going back to the 19th century, has been defined culturally. There was no other way of defining that thing called Germany in the middle of Europe, rather than people who speak the same language, who are one of the two major Christian faiths, etc. There wasn't politically it was very different and difficult. There's a good book by Roger Brubaker who compares France and Germany to actually show this. So these a very heterogeneous type of immigration, plus a very peculiar way of defining citizenship culturally rather than politically as in France, for example. Third point, popular skepticism vis-a-vis immigration. Only around about 2000, this changes to assimilationist, etc. Only from 2000 onwards, this changed a little bit. Especially, the skepticism was especially strong on the political right, and the political right has been dominating German party politics from 1949 onwards, with a few years in between, and even in those few years, when, for example, when Red-Green was in government, they didn't control the second chamber, because in the second chamber there was a lack of a majority, which means progressive legislation concerning citizenship and lowering the barriers for becoming citizens was very difficult to achieve, and was only achieved in the past decade, basically. So that is one reason. That's a further reason. The type of guest worker, immigrant, spoken no German, low income, low social status, and then we had a wonderful description of this. In a school system, educational system that is highly selective, means that even the second generation and the third generation have very, very poor conditions to start with. And becoming a career politician, that's what our data show, requires a university degree in particular kinds of subjects, etc. That means that the supply of potential candidates was extremely low, although through this trade union movement some came through across. And these are the fighters who overcame the rocks, basically. but they're quite exceptional. Very difficult. So, but it is getting better now. It is clearly improving in the 2030 election. So there is something that's changing, and two things are changing in my opinion. One is public opinion is changing, despite all the backlash that we see at the moment. And secondly, the Christian Democrats have realized there's demographic change happening, and fertility rates are going apart, and they will not be able to if they ever want to win again in the bigger cities, and they're losing in the big cities big time at the moment, they will have to either find voters or what somebody said before, they have to appeal to urban voters by looking reasonably progressive. So that's the change. So what I'm trying to do is sort of give a certain interpretation why Germany lagged behind and why there's some change now.
Thomas.
Thank you. In some ways, and I'm going to repeat this tomorrow, Belgium is very similar to Germany. Perhaps Germany should look more to Belgium than to Scandinavia, because what we see in Belgium is very similar to what we see in Germany. So, as was already explained earlier in Mr. Tier's presentation, is that Belgium is kind of a country of immigration, so there's a lot of history there. However, the issue is only salient since a couple of decades, perhaps even less. And on the first slide, we kind of see that reflected in just the sheer number of CIOs that we have present in the legislature. It's only about 4% in total, and even there we kind of have to make a side note because we're talking about 4% of the seats rather than 4% of the people, meaning that a lot of the seats are taken and won again by the same CIO MPs. So in effect, really, a little bit less than half of those CIO MP seats are predominantly taken by about a handful of MPs who are very prominent in the Belgian political landscape. We do see something very interesting. If we go back a little bit towards the 80s, we see that a lot of the CIO MPs enter politics at the end of the 80s or beginning of the 2000s. That's quite an interesting phenomenon. I won't get into that now, but that can be explained due to exogenous factors. If you look at the next slide, there I just gave a brief overview. This is still kind of in parentheses and kind of preliminary, but where most of them actually come from. And we see that most of them have the parentage, so are born in Belgium. When I talk about characteristics of the CIO MPs in Belgium, I'm pretty much going to confirm and repeat everything that Daphne said this morning, because everything what she generally said is kind of true in Belgium. Meaning, if you go to the next slide where you can see the gender division between the CIOs and the non-CIOs, we see actually that, let's say, general minority status, whether it's gender or ethnic minority, that's quite a benefit in the Belgian political landscape. So rather, as opposed to, I think it was France, where the two combined are an extra disadvantage, in Belgium that seems to be quite the opposite. If you go to the next slide, again, kind of confirming what Daphne said this morning, is that in general, the CIO MPs that do get elected to the Belgian chamber are, on average, younger than their non-CIO counterparts. And this is actually, quite a bit. This is almost 10 years younger, if I remember correctly. Yeah. So there is quite the gap here. But again, we need to keep in mind that we're talking about a low number of people here for the CIO MPs. Then there's two general, let's say, interesting conclusions, or not conclusions, perhaps observations that we can make if we go a bit further. That is, first of all, where do these CIOs come from? Where are they elected? In the next two slides, you kind of see we grouped electoral districts together into provinces. And you can see that most of them are actually elected in Antwerp and Brussels, which is not that surprising because those are your immigration hubs in Belgium. But interestingly enough, a lot of them are also elected in Hainaut or Henegouwen, which is perhaps not typically expected But a lot of that can also explain by a couple of MPs who have been systematically elected over and over again in that constituency. But that's certainly an interesting fact that would require a bit more analysis of our part, which we will certainly be doing. Then the second interesting observation, again pretty much in line with everything that was said before, this morning and this afternoon, that is the partisan affiliation of the CIO MPs. In the next two slides, on page 4 and 5, you can see that the vast majority of CIO MPs in Belgium are elected by both of the socialist parties, both on the Walloon side and on the Flemish side. There's a number of parties that even failed to elect throughout 6 legislatures one single CIO MP. And a number of those parties that failed to do so are fairly substantial parties in the Belgian political landscape. Of course, not to name names, I won't, but I mean, the graph kind of speaks for itself. So those are kind of the two remarkable observations. So I think in general what we can preliminarily conclude from Belgium is that, let's say, to put it in kind of populist terms, the disparity between the people and the elite in Belgium seems to be quite large. Thank you. Just perhaps one note, finally, this is a combined effort of 3 universities in the Belgian case, so the Catholic University in Louvain and the 2 free universities in Brussels, just to give credit where credit is due.
That's also
Yes, exactly.
So, Mark, in the Dutch case now,
you're up first, right?
No,
last one, or?
As well?
according to the program, you're next.
Okay, well then I'm the next one. So not the last one, so that's even more difficult. You can conclude, yeah. Well, nevertheless, after all the great interesting life histories of the parliamentarians, I will come up with more descriptive statistics. So I'll be brief. The first graph, I decided to do something different to distinguish between non-Western and Western CEOs, because well, we didn't do that yet today. And on the second slide, the black bar reflects the number of non-Western CEOs, and the white bar the number of Western CEOs in Dutch Parliament. And the red line, that's the line, that's the number of seats needed by non-Western CEOs to be proportionally represented. So what we see from 2003 onwards that non-Western CEOs in the Dutch Parliament are proportionally represented a bit more. So that's really good news. Laura, I think she had even better news because you found for every legislative term that they were proportionally represented. I think that has to do with the reference category I use, data from the Dutch Bureau of Statistics. And you were already defined as a CEO of at least one of your parents who were born abroad. So that's less restrictive, I think, than the definition that you used. That's something we need to look into, because of course my estimate will be more conservative because of that. But still, I would say good news, the Dutch case provides good news. Let's turn to the next slide. Well, that shows that of the non-Western CEOs, the vast majority is first generation, and it's the way around for the second generation. Well, yeah, let me come back to the first slide. Western CEOs, they are not proportionally represented. So the conclusion is non-Western, they are proportionally represented, and non-Western not. Then, on the fourth slide, we can disaggregate non-Western and Western CEOs by countries. So that's not very surprising. We see that the Turkish do very well with 23 seats, followed by the Moroccans, and then followed by Suriname. So it's what struck me a bit of the Western CEOs, I would have expected we also had guest workers from Spain and Greece, but they're not very well represented. Same in Germany, yeah. Then, if we just look whether the different groups of non-Western CEOs are proportionally represented, I started with MPs with an origin from the former Dutch colonies, Indonesia, Suriname, the Dutch Antilles. We see from 2003 onwards they're proportionally represented. For Moroccan CEOs, well, they do very well. They've been proportionally represented throughout the entire sample period. The same goes for the Turkish CEOs, also proportionally represented throughout the entire sample period. Then, well, besides the fact that the Dutch system performs well in terms of the representation of citizens of immigrant origin, we see that if we look at the group of Western CEOs, that men do better than women. It's also that reflects the trend of the Dutch parliament in general. But if we look at non-Western CEOs, females throughout the sample period, they outperform men, so that was already told by Daphne. Also in the Netherlands, well, it's an advantage, well, apparently to be female and to be CEO. But, well, we see in 2003 and 2006, females are really outperforming men, but in 2010, men are making a comeback, they're closing the gap. So, especially in some Dutch more mainstream parties of the mainstream right, there are now some male CEOs represented. So, but still, well, even though the gap is closed, well, 50-50, that's still a pretty good result. If we compare it to the whole parliament as a whole. Only 36% of all parliamentarians throughout the entire sample period was women. Then one of the last slides, I looked at how the number of CEOs are divided over the parties. We see that the Greens, the Dutch party, the Green left, they do very well. They are not a very big party, so it's clear that relatively, they made a huge effort to get CEOs, non-Western CEOs represented. The same goes for the Dutch Labour Party. The Dutch Labour Party also finds it very important to have a lot of women on the party list. But that's not the whole story. We also find CEOs among the radical right. For the radical right, it's of course interesting to make some sort of Nixon goes to China argument, like we have immigrants on our list who are defending also restrictive policies. But again, that's not the whole story. We also have CEOs in the mainstream right who can also be sometimes critical against the party line. For instance, when the Christian Democrats had a crisis over it also of immigration issues. The two conclusions are the main conclusions. Is that since 2003, non-Western CEOs are no longer underrepresented in the Dutch parliament. And well, especially female CEOs are highly represented, but well, CEO men are closing the gap. And maybe the most interesting thing is we have seen a lot of descriptive statistics today, and to think about the reason why. Why is the Netherlands performing so well? Because first I thought, well, it's probably because of the Dutch electoral system. It's extremely proportional, so that means, and also important is the parties, they decide about the order on the list. So if they find it important that women in the parliament or CEOs, they can put them high on the party list. That's less riskful for a party, I think, than in the first past the post system to say, well, we're going to opt for a CEO candidate in this district. But nonetheless, the Dutch and the UK are performing very well, so it can't be the electoral system alone, there must be other explanations. So I was thinking maybe in the Dutch case we have preferential voting in the Netherlands, but also that's not the reason, because I can only think about one female CEO parliamentarian that was elected because of that. So still, it can't be the electoral system alone, so maybe it can be the politicization of the immigration issue. It's a highly politicized issue in the Netherlands already from the 1990s onwards. We had two successful radical right-wing populist parties. We had two political murders. So yeah, that's maybe that could be a reason. But yeah, that's it.
Thank you, Mark. So Daniela.
Thank you very much. So my presentation today will be focusing on the South European cases, Spain, Italy, and Greece. And the first thing I guess that I would would like to highlight from the very beginning is something that has been said in the morning, but nevertheless I want to highlight it once more, is the fact that in comparison with the other countries that have been presented in this workshop, South European cases are generally labeled as new countries of immigration in Europe. Yeah? And this is because they have started to witness substantial migration inflows only quite recently, especially during the decade of the 2000s. Despite of that, these arrivals of foreign residents have been so intense during the past years that by 2014, for instance, foreigners already accounted for around 8% of the population in Italy and Greece and around 11% in the Spanish case. So therefore, given these high shares of the immigrant origin population in Spain, Italy and Greece, these expectations regarding the political inclusion of citizens of immigrant origin can be considered both legitimate and reasonable. Now, in order to better understand these different demands for political representation, we have also examined the composition of the immigrant origin population. And in all three cases, most foreigners, around 70% of them, originate from non-EU countries. In Spain, mostly from Latin America and Africa, of course. In Italy, from non-EU Europe and Africa as well. And in the Greek case, most foreigners originate from other European countries, including both EU and non-EU countries. And if we look at specific nationalities, as you can see in the printed version of the PowerPoint, you can see that in 2015, for instance, Romanians and Moroccans were the largest group of foreigners in Spain, followed by British citizens, Italians, Ecuadorians, and Chinese. And in 2015, Romanians were actually the largest foreign group also in Italy, followed in this case by Albanians and Moroccans. And regarding data for Greece, if we take into consideration, for instance, the 2011 census data, which is the last one that we have available, we see that more than half of all foreigners residing in the country originate from Albania, and other relevant groups in terms of size are, of course, the Romanian group, the Bulgarian group, and the Pakistani. Now, in any case, these figures that I've mentioned so far refer only to foreigners, and obviously in all three cases the size of the immigrant origin population is actually much larger than this, because it also includes all those who are already naturalized as well as their children. And actually this is a very important aspect to be taken into consideration, because the number of naturalizations of acquisition of citizenship in Spain, Italy and Greece has been increasing substantially during the decade of the 2000s. And according to our estimations, between the beginning of the 90s, for instance, and 2013, more than 1 million foreigners naturalized in Spain, around 600,000 did so in the Italian case, and we have around 130,000 for Greece. Now, the next legitimate question would be, how did the public react to these increasing waves of immigration? And our data in this regard shows that the salience of immigration as an important issue at the national level has been increasing, particularly in the first decade of the 2000s. We also see that Spaniards have been generally more concerned about immigration than Italians and Greeks. And in all three countries, the share of those who were concerned about immigration reached an important peak in 2006, yes. And in 2006, the data shows that around 60% of Spaniards, around 30% of Italians, and around 13%, I think, for the Greek case, evaluated immigration as one of the most important issues at the national level. Now, the data of public opinion also shows, for instance, that Italians, Greeks, and Spaniards have generally shown more hostile attitudes, let's say, towards the entry of foreigners in the country than towards immigrants as such. And for instance, by the end of 2010, by the end of the decade of the 2000s, by 2010, around 1 in 4 Italians, Spaniards, and Greeks supported this idea of restricting immigration. But then again, on the other side, we see that the share of those who dislike the idea of having migrants as neighbors, or the share of those who consider immigration as being bad for the economy, is substantially lower. But nevertheless, with somehow more hostile attitudes among Greeks and Italians in comparison with Spaniards. So this already gives you an idea about the public opinion. The next question, what happens with the political parties? So here we have very important differences between our countries. Because on the one hand, we have the Spanish case. In Spain, there is no major nationwide party that clearly has an anti-immigrant discourse. There are some smaller parties with a more radical discourse on immigration, but nevertheless, their electoral support has been very low during the electoral period that we are analyzing. Now, the situation is very different in Italy and in Greece, because in these two cases, we have parties such as Lega Nord, La Destra, Forza Nuova in Italy, or Anel, Laos, or Golden Dawn in the Greek case, that actually managed to gather an important vote shares for the electoral period that we are analyzing. So, summing up, given this complex, let's say, empirical evidence that we have regarding public opinion immigration, the migration inflows, and the position of the political parties on immigration, when we started this research, we actually had several expectations. So, firstly, we expected that Greek, Italian, and Spanish parties will return some CIO MPs, but in a rather symbolic way, as a gesture of adaptation, let's say, to the socialist change. So therefore, we expected a limited presence of citizens of immigrant origin in the national parliaments of these countries. In addition to this, given the fact that we have lower migration inflows in Spain, the fact that Spaniards have generally shown more favorable attitudes towards immigration, and the fact that there is no major anti-immigrant party in Spain, we also expected that the levels of political representation of citizens of immigrant origin will be higher in Spain when compared to Italy and to Greece. Now, thirdly, we've also seen, when analyzing the public opinion data, that there was an increasing anti-immigrant mood during the decade of the 2000s. So therefore, we expected parties to include invisible rather than visible migrants on their electoral list. And finally, we also expected that some immigrant groups, the ones that have higher demographic representation, will reach higher levels of political representation. And regarding the difference between parties, we also expected that left-wing parties would be more prone to include CIOs on their electoral list in comparison with right-wing parties. So, preliminary findings, and what do these preliminary findings actually say about our initial expectations? To begin with, we have identified very low numbers of CIOs in the national parliament of Spain, Italy, and Greece. So bad news for South European cases compared to the other cases. For the moment, we've analyzed only 3 legislative terms for each country, but the data shows that only 1% of all the MPs analyzed in Greece and in Spain actually have an immigrant background. And this proportion is only slightly higher, 1.5%, in the Italian case for more recent terms. So compared to our own estimations of the size of the immigrant population, we are talking about a clear pattern of underrepresentation of CIOs in the national parliaments of these countries. However, we have identified some differences between groups. So for instance, in Spain, most CIOs and MPs do originate indeed from Latin America. But however, none of them actually originates from Romania or from Morocco. For instance, in Italy, on the other hand, most CIOs and MPs originate from other European countries, but nevertheless, the Albanian and the Romanian community did not manage to secure political representation at all. And the same applies basically for Greece, because the largest group of CIOs in Greece, as I mentioned before, Albanians, Romanians, Pakistanis, and Bulgarians, did not obtain political representation, because most CIOs that we've identified in the Greek case originate from other European countries, or from Latin America, or even from the US. We've also started to analyze a little bit the social demographic profile of CIO MPs, and what we've seen so far is that in all 3 countries, most of them are actually highly educated, middle-aged men. Generally, they originate from mixed families in which only one of the parents actually has an immigrant background, and as we initially expected, most of them are invisible rather than visible immigrants. And regarding their political experience, just a few ideas. In Spain, for instance, most CIO representatives counted indeed with a quite long experience in the national parliament. They have been elected for several legislative terms. Whereas in Greece and in Italy, for instance, half of them actually entered the parliament for the first time for these electoral legislative terms that we've analyzed. And also regarding the left-right divide, what we found so far is that most CIOs in Italy and in Greece seem indeed to have been elected on the list of left to the center political parties. But the situation is different in Spain, as Laura was mentioning this morning, because in Spain, around 80% of the CIO MPs that we have identified in our data set actually were elected on the list of People's Party. So we have important differences in this regard. So summing up, preliminary findings for Southern Europe. Very low levels of political representation of citizens of immigrant origin, although with some differences between different groups, as I mentioned before. Secondly, the percentages of CIO MPs seem to be similar across these three countries, despite the differences in migration inflows, in public opinion, and in anti-immigrant parties that I've mentioned. Thirdly, none of these CIO MPs in Spain and Greece, and only few of them in the Italian case, are actually visible minorities according to our definition. And finally, as I just mentioned, left to the central political parties seem indeed to be more prone to nominate CIOs on the electoral list, but then again this applies only for Italy and Greece.